Welcome back to another episode of Rameumptom Ruminations. I'm the host, Scott. Today's very special episode is called Divinity and Gender with Michelle Larson. Thanks for coming back to listen to another episode of Rameumptom Ruminations. I have a very special episode prepared today with a wonderful guest, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. When I spoke at the recent Thrive event in Portland, Oregon, I met this woman, Michelle Larson, and her talk resonated. It was so cool. One of the things that she was discussing was the feminine divine, and specifically her connection with the goddess Kali and this spirituality that she has found after deconstructing Mormonism. I don't want to steal the thunder, if you will, from her. So without further ado, Michelle Larson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Really good to be here.
Before we get into why we brought you here, why don't you tell us a little bit about your life experience and what brought you to this moment here where we're going to discuss the feminine divine.
So I grew up Mormon, and I grew up in quite a nuanced household. So I would say the most important thing that we were taught is to challenge everything. So I grew up in this home where it was quite traditional. My dad was bishop, and we would go to church every Sunday. You know, I kind of went through all the steps, like the young women's, and I went on a mission and went to a church university. I went to BYU, Hawaii.
Okay.
And so, kind of went along that path, but it was like I lived in this home where like Sunstone was really present. My dad was good friends with Chieko Kazaki. So she'd like come into the home, and I'd just hear these like deep discussions happening. And
now for our listeners, who's Chieko?
Chieko Kazaki. Yeah, she was, I think she was part of the General Young Women's Presidency.
Okay.
But she was also this like really badass, like kind of revolutionary. She's originally Japanese American.
Involved with Sunstone?
No, I don't think she was ever involved in Sunstone, but she just would write. And I don't know, like she was just, it felt like she was, like fully part of the tradition. And also, again, like when I'd hear her speak, it felt revolutionary. Like she was talking about women in a way that felt new.
Interesting.
And talking about owning our spirituality in a way that felt like actually from the person, like almost like she spoke with this like inner authority and about inner authority in a way I didn't really like hear in other places. So I grew up in this home that had both tradition and this kind of like open dialogue about things that weren't traditional, or almost like that could be challenged. Like, I use this example of like, at a really young age, noticing where men were included and where women weren't, and really like challenging, the people in my life and asking questions about that. And that was encouraged in my home. So deeply held tradition, and also like really this like a lot of room to explore within that.
Fascinating. That's very atypical. Most Mormons that grow up and are raised as members of the church, that is not their experience at all.
Yeah.
So that's very unique to have been given the ability to question and exist in a space where it was okay to doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, that's revolutionary. And maybe the church will get there eventually. Just not something that most of our listeners will have experienced.
Yeah. And when you say okay to doubt, I would say not just okay to doubt, but encouraged to doubt, really. But it was also like held in like, when I would question, it was like, gosh, why I always got to ask all these questions? Like, for instance, I remember, again, it's like we did all the traditional things. Like I remember coming home from college one summer and our family went on a road trip out to Nauvoo. So we're like in Nauvoo and we're, hopefully some of your listeners are familiar, but it's like there's a lot of reenactment. You go to this home where this happened and this building where this happened. And I remember like being so angry and frustrated about how it's just like not one mention of polygamy. It was just like this like fantasy of like Joseph Smith and Emma with this like beautiful family. And I was, just, and like spending so much energy having these discussions with my dad, my parents about like this is crazy that it's not represented here. I mean, that was the kind of upbringing that I had. And I think, because of that, it actually it's just been a part of my religious process, I would say, for the last 20 years. So, then we're like you're like find other people who have similar questions and you're talking about it. And then the bloggernacle starts and you're like, maybe I'm an agnostic Mormon. And you're like, maybe I'm just agnostic, or, that's kind of was the process for me. And I would say that lately, I would say my real spiritual home, I'm not really nourished by religion or, what happens within the four walls of a chapel very often, because often we're talking about, it's for instance, like you might go to church and then maybe there's a talk about like, we need to share what we have with everyone. But we don't talk about what it is that we have, so it's like some of that, it's like, well, you might go, for a month and no one's actually talked about like love or compassion or the thing that we actually have. We talk about talking about it.
One of the things you said right there really stuck out. And I think a lot of our listeners, especially those listeners that do believe and are still attending, I've had many people reach out to me that they go to church, but they don't feel nourished. They don't feel like everything that's spoken there represents their beliefs and their values, but they go because it's comfortable. They love their friends and family that go, and it's cultural, if you will, but they don't get that nourishment within the four walls. And so when you said that, like many people that I've spoken with, that is exactly what they have said.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a real need for spiritual development in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, whether someone's, people have all kinds of reasons for why they'd stay or why they'd go. But again, like, like for me, that route is like finding spiritual nourishment. And I, what I believe about religion, spirituality is that we are spiritual beings. Part of who we are is that we're spiritual beings. And there's this thing that's just beyond reach that I would call like spirituality. And then we have these like brains and these bodies, and we try to make sense of that. And we make sense of it with our resources that we have, our words, our ideas, and we start to create structure around that.
And stories around that.
And that's how religions have been built from the beginning of time. All that is just humans with this innate sense of like, what is this thing that's unnameable? And then we try to do it and we create religions. And there's beauty there, because there's beauty in the intent that's behind like why, that like who we are, which is, part of who we are is that we are spiritual.
Someone who is deconstructing religion, the word spiritual might be triggering. When you use the word spiritual, you need to find that, because it probably doesn't mean what the members of the church mean when they say it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's so funny. Language is the trickiest thing. We have part of what I do. We have an organization, we have a company called Uplift, and we create resources to support the spiritual development of kids outside of any religious tradition. We use wisdom traditions and modern science to gather resources for families to use to kind of support that spiritual development. And it's so funny because we spend so much time there, like, what is spiritual? What is the word spiritual, and what does that development look like?
Yeah.
So even though it's like a topic of conversation we return to often, it's still a tricky question. So we have these physical bodies that we can touch, and we have these ideas that are they're kind of like thoughts, and then there's something that's beyond that, that's that for me, again, it's that unnameable, transcendent, or it's just the something that, again, for me, it's so many things. It's connection, whether it's connection, like human connection. But let's just keep going. And then I think by my words and what I share, maybe it'll point to what I'm pointing to when I say spirituality.
The way I look at it, we have these two separate entities within each of us. Like you said, we have our physical bodies that you can touch and feel. But then we have our reasoning minds that are separate almost from the bodies. And for me, spirituality is trying to integrate those two things and trying to make them work together and be one. And that's, at least for me, that's how I look at spirituality and the meditative practices that I incorporate in my life.
Yeah, you're also pointing to another tricky word. It's our wholeness, because I think it's connected to wholesome, which again, all these words have so much baggage for us. So it's any word I say, just insert the one that's pointing to what we're trying to point to without being able to name it, because words mess it right up. But yeah, that's I hear you talking about wholeness. And again, it's we have our physical bodies, we have our thinking mind, we have we're intellectual beings, we're sexual beings, we're, physical beings, we're all of these things. And then there's something that is the isness of what we are.
So let's jump into the subject that we were going to discuss. And I wanted to go at length because the thing that stuck out to me in your talk that you gave at Thrive, you reframed the feminine divine in a way that I'd never seen before. This alternate definition of what the feminine divine might look like, and that was fascinating to me. And then you related a story about being on an airplane and reading a book, and I don't know if that's one that you intended on bringing up, but I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I'll get to some of those, but I'll say that, I grew up with the feminine divine absent, and anything that included the feminine was always in relation to something else. It was the companion of something, or it was almost through this male gaze of otherness. So for me, actually, even centering the feminine is again, it's this revolutionary act. It's a revolutionary act in my own life. I mean, it's anytime we talk about the divine, my only access to that is through also my lived experience. I mean, we can reach out to the divine, but it's in my own life, women, it felt like we were in relation to men, or to the patriarchy.
Eve being created from the rib of Adam in one of the Genesis tellings.
Yeah. Your access to the divine is actually through another man. It's everything is through the priesthood or through men. So for me, actually coming across the feminine divine, it's we need mirrors. We need to see ourselves in order to even center ourselves. So that process has actually helped me center even myself in my own being, by actually having access to the feminine divine. Yeah, it's the study of the feminine divine is actually the study of myself, which myself is just all of us. So yeah. And part of that is also this embrace of the masculine and the feminine. And for me, that's really, I have a teacher who he's created integral polarity practice. It's called IPP, and it really works with polarities. So I'll just introduce polarities in just a little way, but this practice has helped me It's actually helped bring some of the things in my life that are unconscious into consciousness. So like, for example, in polarity practice, you might take any given polarity. Like, for instance, one that was insight to me was like the individual and the collective. And that in that there's these pluses and minuses about the individual, and there's pluses and minuses about the collective. Like, in a collective, we feel like this companionship. We feel like we have support. But if we like are too enmeshed in a collective, we start to feel like suffocated. We start to feel like, exhausted. The individual, you have like kind of like rest, and you have like independence and creativity, but too much independence leads to like loneliness, isolation. And so through something like polarity practice, I actually realized in my family of origin, it was so centered around the collective that, through these kind of like these practices, through polarity practice, I could map it out and see, or like through meditation, see like, oh, everything that's good about an individual, I see as bad. So like I saw independence as selfishness. I saw rest as like laziness. So it was like through this polarity practice that I could see there was a whole part, so instead I would just like go up and down through the good and the bad of like a collective. And I could never reach over here into the its opposite, which is like so desperately needed in my life and anyone's life. So polarity practice helps, that one of the principles of polarity practice is that actually, instead of kind of like thrashing around between the good and the bad of both of these, that there's this still point where we can fully receive the fullness of any given polarity. And in that fullness, like that contains like access to to everything. And so for me, it meant I'm not burning out. I'm not like working so hard that I'm like, why isn't anybody else working as hard as I am? Like, oh, if you rest for a minute, then like actually, then you want to go back and be with a group, so through that practice, that same principle for me applies to the masculine and the feminine. Like this is just, and it's part of nature. These polarities are natural patterns that are happening. And we come in and we're like, we grow up and we have all these experiences that like block us from some of these. So,
well, we have the cultures that we've come from have actively blocked the feminine divine. I mean, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I mean, we have a mother in heaven, but she's almost ignored and eschewed to the side. And while there and present, we can't access her at all.
Yeah.
And so she exists, but kind of just in theory. And then kind of on the flip side, if we're just going to look at Christianity as a whole, the Catholics do have a version of the feminine divine in the Mother Mary and some of the saints that they do interface with to a certain extent. So they do have access to a little bit of the feminine divine, but it's not all the way there, even in these practices that you get in some of the other Christian faiths.
Yeah. I mean, my experience growing up was, it was so disjointed because on the one hand, we're taught that women are so important. It's this false pedestal that women are put on where, we're taught like we're so important, we're so special, and yet don't have any power. So it's like, It's like so many things in the world, including some of the things within the church. It's like it's built on the backs of women, and it's women are silenced. So yeah, I grew up with a silenced mother goddess, she's so special, we don't speak of her. I mean, I use this example of like when it comes to women in the priesthood, if the priesthood is like acts, like power to act in God's name or access to a God or divinity, like that's just a natural, to me, that's something that we naturally have. I mean, then we have this organizational side of it, but to be told like, oh, well, women don't have the priesthood because they're just so naturally spiritual, they don't need the priesthood. And there's something in that that's like, again, if we don't have the power to actually use that within an organization or even our own lives, And there's this other piece of it too that's like, when I had children, I think like I'd look at my like 2-year-old son and think don't say that, because if you keep saying that, he's going to believe it, and it's not true.
Yeah.
So for men and women, until we access the feminine divine, I think that the church itself, or religions in general, when they can fully embrace the masculine and feminine, like, it'll blow our minds. Like, who knows what will happen when we actually fully live into the feminine and the masculine. Like I described, like when we find that still point, or when we access that still point and we have access to the fullness, then I mean, that to me, that's divinity. So, for me, I don't, an embodied God,
Anthropomorphized.
I don't know about that. Maybe not. There's an embodied God, but I do know that, developmentally, like for some people, like an embodied God with like a physical body, flesh and blood, like that's really important. For some people, like the idea of God is really important. Like the stories we tell and the metaphors, that's important. For some people, like they actually, to find themselves and their path, like they actually need to distance themselves from any kind of God. Like all are good. All are just people figuring it out. But like, because there are so many people that actually do relate to a physical God, like having physical goddesses is also important. Like we know what the masculine God does and is. And there's so many traits in our masculine God, even in Christ, that are also feminine. It's like, it's all there. But we need these representations, I think, of like all types, because for me, really, God itself, like it's non-binary. Like I don't actually, gender and God, I think there's something that's actually beyond that, but we also need it. So it's like both, integrating both, I think, helps us get access to who we are.
Many of the people in the post-Mormon community, I have listeners that are both believers, nuanced, and that have left, or that are in with the spouse, attending, even though they don't believe. But many people, and I would say the vast majority that I've spoken with that leave, they land on either agnosticism or atheism. And the whole concept of spirituality is off-putting to them. Myself, I identify as an agnostic. I find spiritual fulfillment in studying the myths, and I find this spiritual fulfillment in stories, in movies, and just everywhere I look. I can find things that will fill my soul and teach me the things that bring me closer to this oneness that we described earlier.
It's really beautiful. And also, like, I feel this like deep honor for everyone wherever they are on their own path, on their own journey. It's like even if someone has distanced themselves from it, I also have deep honor for that, whether that's for a time or forever. Like I value somebody who actually says, I need to not have this in my life. And what you're pointing to is actually, yeah, kind of this embrace of, I think about, it makes me think about archetypes. I don't know how that lands for you, but
I love Joseph Campbell. I've read just about everything he's published. So
oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, it's great. So I think like the Greek root of archetype actually means original pattern. And I think there's something, whether we believe in a God or not, there's like these patterns of being human. And there's something about, again, I don't know what you or your listeners, what resonates, but for me, like we see ourselves, like we tell these stories about who we are, and we see ourselves as like the main character of our story. So we're telling these stories, we're the main character. And there's something about, again, this original pattern or these archetypes that connect us with like universal consciousness. And it can help get us out of our own experience to actually then also understand our own experience. So
yeah,
we kind of like see ourselves through these mirrors, and these archetypes of like the God or the goddess, like they actually connect us deeply to our deepest power. whether that's like religious or not, it's something about like the kundalini, the like life energy of being human, that when we can step outside of ourselves, like we have actually more access to that.
Yeah. When I was first deconstructing, I found that stories just outside of religious context resonated with me in much the same way that the scriptures did when I was a believer. And I think that even someone who has completely left religion and God behind, when they're reading books or watching a show and they see that human interaction and they see this universal story, that the hero's journey, if you will, in all of these stories, the reason it resonates is because that's everyone's story.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you're not seeing it as in a spiritual lens, that's spirituality, when you're connecting with the rest of the world through this universal experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And we don't get quite so caught up in our own ego, in our own story, when we can connect to that. I said before, like divinity, like to me, ultimately, it kind of transcends our concepts of gender. And yet we also, like, whether it's male or female, there is also something about seeing these patterns represented. We've had so many, for thousands of years, it's actually been represented through masculinity and maleness. And so,
Yeah.
To actually see some of these through this, again, like really uniting this polarity of masculine and feminine, some of these, these goddesses, these female figures of divinity have been really informative for me. You mentioned one of them is Kali. So this Hindu goddess of Kali. Yeah, I think the feminine that has been represented in a lot of religious, you mentioned the Catholic, the Catholic saints.
The Mother Mary and the saints, yeah.
And in some ways it's funny, like growing up, Mormon, there's this, we've got it. We've got the stuff. These other religions, they don't really have the stuff.
They're worshiping saints. They don't have the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was crazy for me when I actually, realized the ways that there's like a saint for headaches. There's a saint for grief, for loss. It's like, actually there's something really beautiful about the way that, that particular organization or religion has integrated.
Part of it was when the Catholic Church would spread to a new area, they would incorporate whatever local deities and then like rename them and then create holidays around the same time. And so they were going around gobbling up these other gods from these other cultures. And like you said, it's really cool that they have incorporated all these different types of deities in the form of saints.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that there's so many women represented.
Yes.
That there are men and women that access like male and female saints. So there's actually something quite beautiful there.
So we live in a patriarchal society, and we have, for thousands of years in the Judeo-Christian world, God has been this masculine form, this masculine entity. And the feminine has been missing for women, but it's also something that men need as well.
In my own life, growing up Mormon, I felt like there was, these gender roles that were prescribed to us. And I had, I went to college, graduated with my undergraduate, worked, started having children right away. And we started building these businesses, my husband and I and some family members, 3 kids later. And my husband is like, he's so busy in our businesses. And I'm like chasing kids around, working part-time with our companies, and feeling quite suffocated as a mom. And also like I could never quite access and do the work I really wanted to do. And so about that time when my youngest was about 6 months old, my husband and I like had a conversation, and we actually switched roles. So my husband, who's actually much more suited to run a household than I am. We switched roles. And so, and it was so liberating for both of us, like the liberation for me of like building a business. It's just, I'm so well suited for that. And for him, like he was so happy at the end of the day to like have cleaned the house and like made a meal for us and like been with the kids. It was so soothing for his soul. And like, so, like if we didn't feel empowered, and that was a hard shift, like everything was against us to make that shift. But if we hadn't felt empowered to make those decisions, like he could fully become himself and I could fully become myself, because we actually like let go of everything and said like, what works for us? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Having access to what is the feminine and divine, or what is the feminine and masculine, and then just like letting go and living into that in the way that's ours to live into. But again, because we've been kind of saturated and flooded with the masculine, we need to like, we're not gonna embrace something if there isn't power there. If we don't see the power of it. So again, until we like see the work that has traditionally been women's to do, we don't want to embrace that if it's not seen as worthy or whole, or just like, if it's not empowered. So by actually empowering these like both sides, masculine and feminine, then we can live into who we're supposed to be without, so again, infusing, I think there'll be thousands of years more before the work that women have done is seen as having worth. The fact that women don't make as much money as men, there's just, and not in a way to like judge what it's been, but just to say, oh, there's still an imbalance. So I think for men, whether I don't think men need to study the feminine divine, but I think by actually, like, if they are drawn to that, like, they're actually coming home to themselves. All of us are coming home to ourselves, and we have so much access to the masculine. So we actually do need to find ways to incorporate the feminine.
I think there are a lot of elements of deity that we ascribe to masculine or feminine that are just cultural, that have nothing to do with what is innately masculine or innately feminine. Something like housework or dishes, like that has nothing to do with being a woman or a man. Those are just things that you need to do to keep your house up.
Yeah.
But we incorporate them. We incorporate our culture and the way we view men in society and women in society. We project those identities onto deity, and suddenly the heavenly mother becomes the heavenly household keeper. And the heavenly father is the heavenly breadwinner.
Yes.
We're projecting these ideas of our culture onto them. If we go back 2,000 years, the idea of deity, of masculine and feminine, is going to be influenced by whatever culture is talking about them. The way I look at this, if you truly want to understand it, you need to strip your cultural lens from deity before you can really even begin to understand it.
Yeah. So at this point, again, I don't know. These can, because language is so layered and, it's just like infused with our cultural experience. Even at this point in our conversation, I have this question around the way that people might even be triggered about the words of masculine and feminine. And I just want to say, like, as I say those words, they're actually outside of gender. I'm actually not talking about men and women. I'm talking about these patterns of the masculine, like it might be more linear, where feminine might be more circular, like masculine might be more assertive and feminine might be more receptive. And that has nothing to do with men and women. These are just like patterns and energies that move in us as humans. So I just want to make sure we're not getting caught up on like what you just said, like this is outside of gender. And even though these, like, we infuse our, our gods and our goddesses with these gendered words and experiences, it's actually, it's when I say masculine and feminine, it has nothing to do with that. These are just patterns and energies.
That's not something that I had ever been presented before, but I think innately I understood that, but I just had never put words to it like that.
Yeah, and I think like it has to do with power too, because you think about, like, again, masculine energy is going to be more direct. It's going to be more like kind of, again, linear, where feminine energy might be more like somewhat swirly and chaotic. And then we like take our cultural thinking around that and we say, like, when we don't really honor masculine and feminine and we infuse it with our experience, we might say something like, oh, women are like, they're so chaotic and they're like, like, just like, say your thought. And then we might say, like, well, men are, they're just really intellectual, and they're, and what we're actually really talking about is something everyone has access to, which is just an energy of, like, directness, or, kind of more like circular motion. It's like,
These are elements that we all express regularly.
Yeah.
And, to one degree or another, one maybe more feminine, one more masculine, but these are elements inside all of our personalities.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something we all have access to, all of these things. And we, without unconsciously, we might actually limit ourselves from some of them because of the way that culture has ascribed meaning and value to those traits.
Specifically, in the culture, the men are supposed to act one specific way, and the women are supposed to act another specific way, and these line up with the feminine and the masculine.
Yeah.
And like, it's so limiting on a person to develop and become their full selves. That's something that I struggled with for a long time growing up, because just the kind of toxic masculinity present in our culture. I never felt like this masculine energy represented me all the way. I never experienced gender, dysphoria, but I just didn't feel like the image of the alpha male was me. At least growing up, I was told, this is the type of person that you're supposed to be. And I just didn't resonate with that. But not in a way where I resonated and wanted to be a different gender, but I just didn't feel like this masculine energy was the full depiction of the person that I am.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it really comes into play around emotions and like showing emotion. And like, I mean, there's studies that have been done, like, children up until they hit kindergarten, like they actually can, they like express emotion in a really similar way. And then they hit kindergarten and like, it's like somehow, somewhere, with no words being spoken, men are taught, like, it's not okay to cry, and like crying is seen as a feminine and a female thing to do. And yet, like, like, what do we do if we've enculturated a whole part of society to say, like, hey, it's not okay to express emotions in these ways? Or even anger. Like, anger is such a beautiful thing, like masculine and feminine anger. It's like, well, I know I'm not supposed to, like, just outrage, so for a man, they're like, I don't even know what to do with my anger, because I either hold it inside or I burst it out, and like, and then women, like, they're taught, like, well, I'm not supposed to be angry. And so instead it turns into like, it comes out sideways. It turns into like sadness when, like, oh, I'm just sad. Like, no, you're actually angry, like, it's okay to express anger. So again, when I go back to polarities, like when we can live into the fullness of who we are, like we're not like shoving down the emotion of like cry, like, if, it's like we can cry when we need to cry. If we can be angry and let that burn through, like, that will actually let us live into who we're supposed to be.
This has been a fascinating discussion. I am loving where this is going. I still have so many more questions. I want to dig a little bit deeper onto this feminine divine and introduce the listeners to some examples of the feminine divine so that they can incorporate them and understand this other energy better. So I'd love to have you on next week. We'll chat a little bit more. Thank you so much, Michelle, for coming. This has been a pleasure.
It's just been great to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Is there anything that you want to plug before we say goodbye for tonight?
I mean, I am on here as, just like Michelle, the individual, but I do want to just say, I reference polarity practice, and there's the work of John Kessler and his work with integral polarity practice, and I've actually learned about that through one of my colleagues, friends, and teachers, Thomas McConkie, and him and Gloria Pack have started an organization called Lower Lights. And it's actually through that I've actually really had access to polarity practice, which has really, again, opened me up to something like the masculine and feminine, and embracing these, all the extensive poles of any given opposing, like the yin and yang, or the polarity. So I have found so much acts that when we talk about like spiritual nourishment, it's these types of practices that I've been really nourished in these communities. So Lower Lights, it's been a great place for me to really grow into my own.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for coming today, and we will see you back on the show next week.
Great. Thank you.
So that concludes the chat that I had today with Michelle Larson. She's a fantastic woman. I hope that you enjoyed our chat and perhaps learned a thing or two, and a new way to look at the relationship between gender and masculinity and femininity, the fluid nature of masculine and feminine. And as I said at the end of the interview, we didn't touch everything that I wanted to chat about, so we will bring Michelle back onto the show next week. We're going to dive deeper into the feminine divine, and we're going to discuss some of the divine female characters in myth from around the world. It is going to be an incredible discussion. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you all have an excellent day.